Hello and welcome back to The Red Path. Today we're going to talk about deployment and how to best use it as a world eater and as a combat army player. But before we get into that, I just want to give a quick shout out. One of our viewers, subscribers, sent me this picture of their son Alex in a amazing Khorne the Betrayer cosplay here, and I should have a picture up on the screen right now. And I had to share this because it's such a badass picture, such a great picture, and it's always good to see younger people getting into the hobby, getting into it, and especially getting into world eaters. So I know Alex occasionally watches the channel, so if you're watching this, mate, that's an amazing costume, and blood for the blood god. All right, anyway, so we are gonna dive into this. We're going to talk about deployment, staging, getting lines of sight, all kinds of good stuff, and how to best get the good results, the wins, the victories, the how to claim the skulls from the deployment phase. And that's coming up next. So the first type of terrain we're going to have a quick look at is the Games Workshop open terrain. This is typically 4 large ruins and then 2 smaller ruins and 4 dense pieces. You'll see on the screen now we've got 4 large central ruins, 2 at the side, and then 4 coded green dense pieces. They're still area terrain, but they're dense typically. The second type of terrain we're going to look at is player place terrain. This is typically used at FLG events and stuff like that, and in a lot of local metas, but typically what you have is a set amount of terrain pieces, including large, medium, small ruins, maybe a dent or a crater, something like that, and you place it yourself. This is kind of a mini game, and it's something you really need to practice with. If your local meta uses it, you probably know what I'm talking about, or if you're going to go to an FLG event, I'd definitely try and get some practice in, but you get to place the pieces of terrain where you want. There are rules about where they can be, but that's about it. And the third type of terrain is typically something like WTC. You have variants like UKTC and other types, but it's often quite a lot of terrain, a lot of obscure and ruins and things like that on the table, and they offer a lot of lines of sight or blocks to lines of sight, lots of places to stage your units and prepare for assaults and things like that. And we're actually going to dive in and use this setup. So we're going to use this WTC layout to just kind of demonstrate how to look at the battlefield, see where the strong and weak points are, and how you would set up for staging your army. So we just set it up for mission 11 here. So we can see if we were to deploy on this side behind the red line, we need to look at the objectives. We have a strong objective here and here. This back one is obviously strong because it's the furthest distance from our opponent's army, but it's also got a nice big piece of obscuring terrain here, and it's going to be very difficult for enemies to get lines of sight on it. So this would be a good one for like a weak unit to defend your cultists or a chaos spawn, something like that. So we would just sit them somewhere like here. Optimally, we'd probably put most of them in this piece of terrain here, just to give them as much protection as possible from line of sight and everything else, and just have a couple staggered out, something like that. It's not perfect, but it does for this video. So next we see this objective is also quite strong because it's partially covered. Obviously this is technically illegal, but you'd get something like it because you can't have terrain on top of the 40mm objective part, but whatever. So this is protected by an obscuring ruin here. So this would be a good place to have a combat unit ready to stage behind. So we would probably deploy something like this. You would want to check your lines of sight and stuff, may stagger a bit more, something like that, just because we can kind of see from this corner and here, there may be a very narrow line of sight the opponent can get shooting wise, so we want to try and avoid that. You would, in a real game, you would use like a laser line or something, but we're just doing this for a demonstration. That's what you're looking for. You're trying to avoid easy lines of sight for your opponent using the terrain to break that up, and giving yourself a good position to stage from. So turn one, you know, we may advance, we may just normally walk, probably do something like this. Because these are berserkers and probably not charging turn one, they would probably advance. Let's just say we get a 2-inch charge or something, that's fine. We are touching the objective. We could actually touch the terrain as well, so let's just go ahead and do that with some of the models. TTS, gotta love it. So anyway, so yeah, we'd just do something like that, get a few cover saves in the off chance that, you know, they had flying units, it was Tau or something where they could come in and zip over here and shoot us. We'd get a few cover saves. We're touching the objective with OBSEC. We're in a good position for turn 2, turn 3 to stage, or we are staged, to move out and assault this objective, which is their vulnerable one. Likewise, we have a vulnerable objective right here, in that you can get a line of sight from the enemy deployment zone here. You can get a shorter line of sight, you know, if they're touching this terrain here, and they can also stage assaulting units through this piece of terrain. Now these walls in the middle are not breachable, so they, unless they have fly, they wouldn't be able to easily get there. So what you want to do on this kind of objective is put something a bit tougher. So in this list I'm just showing here, we might have a land raider, and we might actually set up our contemptors to be here as well, because whilst we are vulnerable, the opponent is also vulnerable. So 3, now this is obviously overkill, but we're doing a demonstration. 3 contemptors here have got a great line of sight to absolutely chew up whatever is on that objective, and anything that's coming here is going to have a hard time. That you got 3 contemptors which are quite resilient, you've got a land raider. We're locking this down. We'd probably have our other squad of berserkers nearby, maybe in the land raider, maybe behind this piece of terrain, so they can come out and assist where necessary. And then I would probably have my other land raider to come out to somewhere like this, so it can draw a bead over here. Now obviously your opponent is going to tuck a unit back here most likely, but using other assets, for instance the Master of Executions and our Terminator Lord here, maybe they're still inside the land raider, and if we were actually positioned to play this properly, you know, we can do our 3-inch move, 3-inch disembark and 5-inch move to get a nice 8 inches for the Terminator Lord, put him somewhere like that, and then he would be in a position to countercharge whatever's in there. So those are the kind of things you want to look at when making your deployment. You want to make sure that you put units with firepower, for instance these contemptors, in a position where they can, in their first turn, move out and draw a nice line of sight on a target area. For instance, this quite vulnerable objective. But likewise, they need to be protected turn 1 as much as possible. You're not always going to be able to protect yourself from everything. Like I said, Tau are very good at just really ignoring terrain because of their speed and long range and access to non-line of sight and things like that. But you don't want to make it easy for them. For instance, if we are positioned here and a Tau model wants to come out, it's going to have to come over here to get a line of sight on this. It's going to come in this area over here. Now if we've got our land raider and say it's full of berserkers, they'll probably kill something, maybe 2 units here, it's hard to tell, but depending on what it is, it will then be vulnerable to our combat, which is where we start to seek the advantage. So yeah, you want to be looking for your vulnerable and the enemy vulnerable's objectives, what you can put into position to be staged. For instance, the example I gave with these berserkers behind this nice piece of terrain which blocks line of sight truly, like naturally, because it's got no windows on the first floor, you can see here, and it also is obscuring anyway and gives light cover and things like that, and it also allows us to hold this objective. So we would actually take quite a defensive posture here on this vulnerable one with our ranged assets, and we would take a more aggressive one over here. We'd probably have this other land raider or something to kind of sit there, maybe back it up with another spawn back here in case the assault from the berserkers fails. But then these berserkers are in a position to eventually come out, assault over here. Hopefully whatever is there between the berserkers and the shooting from our assets over here should be killed. And remember, you don't have to control every objective. You're just trying to get more objectives than your opponent, or to, you know, deny your opponent as much primary as possible. So you want to have, where possible, this army isn't really ideally set up for it, but If you had multiple assault units, you would have 2 or 3 assault units over here. So after the first wave has neutralized it and probably gets cut down in response, the second wave is ready. It's already staged behind this nice block of terrain to come out and do the same again and just keep flipping that objective while we securely hold R3. Therefore, your opponent should never be able to get 12 points for primary, in theory. You know, we can't promise that because your opponent may have a better army that's equipped to deal with your forces, but as a overview, that's what you want to do. You want to look for those sight lines and you want to look for great pieces of terrain that you can stage behind. Now if we had jump troop units, let's just pretend these berserkers here are warp talons or something, this is a wonderful position for them. Somewhere like here, you know, obviously depending on where your enemy is positioned and what they've got, but because of fly, they would be able to zip out their 12 inches to, you know, here. They could probably get into this terrain or, yep, somewhere in the terrain. And then they'd be ready for a nice charge on whatever they needed to hit. So you've really got to look for those key pieces of terrain with regards to your defensive posture on your objectives and how you can use lines of sight on your opponent's objectives to, you know, basically obliterate them off them, or be in a position to charge through them. So it doesn't matter whether you're shooting, whether you're charging, whatever. Get your position, your models in position with your first turn, possibly your first 2 turns, pre-game moves, any assets you've got. Keep them hidden, keep them protected, and then unveil them when the time is, you know, absolutely necessary, especially with your charges, because it's such a vulnerable decision. If it goes wrong, it can really swing a game against you. So yeah, that's just kind of the basics of what to look for when deploying and when staging. Finally, let's do an example of how I might deploy on a given mission. We're trying 22 conversion here. Obviously, I'm not going to deploy an opponent. We'll just go for the sort of things that I would probably do in most situations. So one thing about a mission like this is it's going to be a hold 1, hold 2, hold more. So typically, most players will hold their home, their closer objective in no man's land, because this one is actually about 8 inches away, maybe 9, just over 8, but this one is quite a bit further, yeah, about 11 inches away to touch the objective. So typically people will hold their home, this one, and then fight off the center there. Something I like to do to kind of reduce the enemy assets that are actually engaging with me is make an early cheap dash for this objective to draw out some of their units, but actually pivot the table to hold these 3. So what we would do, this is the army I'm going to be deploying here because it's just something similar to what I'm testing right now. We've got 2 Land Raiders, 3 Volkite Contemptors, 2 squads of 8 Berserkers, squad of Cultists, a Spawn, 2 Warp Smiths. We've got Master of Executions with Hateful, or Hatred Incarnate, and then we've got the Chaos Terminator Lord, who is rocking the Mantle of Traitors. So what we would do, probably in this order, but you know, there is an element of counter deploying. This blue Land Raider, or blue outlined Land Raider, has actually got the squad of Cultists in it. I would deploy it something like this. The reason for that is that means turn 1, the Cultists can disembark their 3, which is something like that. Then they would move their 6 and they would automatically be able to touch this objective. I'd probably give them an advance, and you know, I would try and get them something back here if possible, but I just want them touching that objective just to make sure the opponent has a reason to come out here and commit something. Anything more than 50 points, which is what the cultists cost, is going to be fine. Alternatively, I could risk starting the Spawn up here and trying to get a 2 or 3 inch advance on him, but the times I've done that, I always roll a 1. So that would be my first deployment right there, putting the Land Raider here. In addition, he's protected from any easy shooting turn 1 because of this large piece of obscure here, this piece here, and then he's in a position where he can move up here to have a line of sight in this part of the board, or additionally he can move somewhere in the center and get lines of sight here, help threaten there. Because another thing I tend to like to do is after I've deployed a Land Raider, I will actually stage, you know, my Berserkers, something like this, So they'll be able to, once the cultists have disembarked, they'll just move over here, maybe in advance to get within 3 if necessary. This will all be pre-measured, of course, and they'll actually embark on there. So then the Land Raider would move. Let's say he would move somewhere over here. So our first deploy is the Land Raider there. Then we'll put our Berserkers, something like that. Next, I've noticed really the best lines of sight are from over here, because we get some over here, and then we get pretty much the entire central objective, which is going to be hotly contested. So I'm probably going to put my Contemptors in this kind of position. Not 100%, but would be something like that. They're going to be covered from shooting turn 1 at this angle here, or that would be the intent. I mean, it may not be perfect right now, but my intent would be to have them covered there. Now, the opponent could obviously move down this way, so depending on what assets they've got, if they've got fast, very shooty things, I would obviously pre-measure, and we may end up hiding a little bit more like that, because with an 8-inch move, these guys will be able to come out to where they need to be and get lines of sight all the way down here and all the way over here. It's not perfect, because this piece of terrain and this piece of terrain do offer them a lot of defensive, but it does offer me good range, and then I'm in a position to, as the game progresses, you know, move further up the board and deal with that as possible. But let's say these guys are something like this. Now, I know they're going there, and I'm going to want my Warpsmiths near them, because most likely the Warpsmiths are going to be giving them +1 to hit, potentially a Land Raider depending on my target. So my Warpsmiths are going to be positioned again behind Obscuring, but they're going to be within 6 inches. Well, we would do something like that. Make sure that the Warpsmiths are able to give their command phase buff of +1 to hit. Our Chaos Lord and Terminator armor is probably going to be more front lined. Again, this piece is true line of sight blocking, so I'm not too worried. If they add very fast Alpha Strike combat, I would put a screen in front of him, but let's pretend they don't. So the reason for that is because the Contemptors are core, he's actually offering them rerolls of 1. So once they've moved out, he would just reposition to give them rerolls, do whatever we need to do there. My second Land Raider, I'm probably going to be a bit more aggressive with. It's probably going to come, depending on angles, something like this. The reason is, this... Oh, it's not actually dense. Never mind, I thought that was dense. Nevertheless, if the opponent sees this and takes the bait, they're going to deploy either some shooting over here, or in a position where it can move out and get line of sight. Now, the Land Raider can pop smoke. It's quite tough. I kind of always anticipate losing something turn 1, but the reason for that is it will draw out opponents into this kind of area here, where they'll have to draw line of sight on it and pump out a lot of shots to really do some damage. That being said, my second squad of Berserkers will be tucked in here somewhere, like that. I will probably put my Chaos Spawn over, something like that. If they want to waste shooting on a Chaos Spawn, but he's in a position where he can easily jump over there. And then the Master of Executions will be tucked back in here as well. So the Master of Executions and the Berserkers will probably be in a position to embark on the Land Raider turn 1 if it survives. If not, they'll position up, move north up the table here, or go for some advances over here. But my aims are to draw the opponent over here with my cultists, hopefully getting behind in this position, draw some of their resources over here. My Berserkers will jump in here, Berserkers will jump in here, Contemptors will come out here. And what I'll do is I'll push this Land Raider over here. This Land Raider, if it survives, will go somewhere over here. Chaos Spawn, potentially just to put something on the objective turn 1 to force my opponent to try and kill it off. They'll have to commit something, because Chaos Spawns are just that much tougher than they were, that they will need to commit something more than just, you know, like 5 bolt pistols or whatnot. So after my turn 1, if everything goes to plan, my deployment would hopefully, my army would look something like this. It's going to take a second to move everyone, but so these guys are all going to be inside the Land Raider here. The red squad are inside the blue Land Raider. probably have our Contemptors somewhere over here. Obviously position better, the Lord would be here. We'd have one Warpsmith tagging behind. We'd have another one just towing the objective. What we'd probably actually try and do is make sure the Land Raider is positioned to be within 6, something like that, so I can give him the buffs and do repairs if necessary and things like that. That way my army is now positioned to reasonably safely for the first couple of turns, maybe up to turn 3, hold my home objective, fight over the centre objective and begin assault in this one, whilst my opponent would be committing some resources over here, some resources here, and probably they'll have their weaker elements over here, like a squad of basic troops, regular marines, or something like that. So I should be in a position to start overpowering them with my turn 1 movement, regardless of if I go first or second, because I should have relatively decent protection from most of their assets, other than my Land Raider here. The Land Raider and the Spawn, I guess, would be the most vulnerable, but like I said, it forces them to come out here, typically, potentially down here as well, but because my intent is to get my Berserkers and this Land Raider over here, and my Contemptors over here for shooting purposes, whatever they put there that does some damage on here, if it's going to damage a Land Raider, it's going to be something pretty crucial. You do have to bear in mind things like crisis suits, which can do fire and fade and things like that. So there's obviously a lot more to consider than that. But think about how you're going to take objectives turn 1, how you're going to shoot vulnerable positions that your enemy is in, and what you're going to be able to do, and whether the things that are shooting are quite resilient. Like Land Raiders are tough, they are expensive, and then, you know, not competitive. This isn't a super hot list or anything, but they do require commitment. Contemptors are also annoyingly tough for enemies to deal with -1 damage and a 3-up, 5-up. Decent range, so they can sit back over 45 inches. You know, I'd backline them where possible. Just all the little things you can do to really overextend your opponent. That is your aim, especially as a combat army. You want your opponent overextended, because then you get your advantage of, you know, your 9-inch 3-inch disembark, 6-inch move, and then you know you can position for like a 6-inch charge over the centre here. And if you manage to get it so your squad of 8 Berserkers haven't died yet to any explosions or anything like that, a squad of 8 Berserkers is going to do a lot of damage to pretty much any target, and they're going to flip this objective, and you'll keep trading like that. But yeah, that's just a kind of basic view of how I might deploy with this kind of army on this kind of map. So hopefully that guide helps you out a little bit, gives you some tips, some pointers, a way to think about how you're going to deploy. It's not all inclusive, and there are so many things you have to consider. You have to consider your opponent's army, what their mobility is like, what their range is like, how good they are at counter-assaulting you, how resilient they are, what sort of firepower you're going to need to bring to take them off objectives, what your delta point for scoring on the primary is. There's just too much to go into. But I did want to just focus on the raw basics, the absolute fundamentals of looking at the terrain, looking at the mission, and where you should and can position your units to bring them to their most effective. So yeah, hopefully that helps you out a little bit and gets you on the path to claiming more and more skulls for the Skull Throne. So yeah, hopefully if you want to learn more, a good resource for that is to come and join our Discord. We're always pushing that. But yeah, there's a link below. Please come and join the Discord. It's a great place where you can hang out and we can talk about this sort of stuff and hopefully improve all our games. So anyway, until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill main bird.